6 engines, 6 verdicts, one mistake that would cost a billionaire far more than money. The auction hall fell into an uneasy hush as the digital display climbed again. $2,700,000. $2,800,000. Every bidder's paddle seemed to rise with greater urgency than the last, while reporters hurried to update headlines they had never imagined writing. At the center of it all stood Victoria Sterling, the billionaire CEO whose decisions had shaped one of America's largest industrial manufacturing companies. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, survived economic downturns that buried competitors, and built a reputation for never making emotional decisions. Yet now she stared silently at 6 weathered turbine engines lined beneath the bright showroom lights like forgotten relics rescued from another era. Their faded identification plates still bore the words property of Sterling Dynamics. 8 weeks earlier, she had personally signed the paperwork declaring every one of them beyond repair. Her engineering division had agreed unanimously. The inspection reports filled hundreds of pages. Corrosion, thermal fatigue, internal damage, obsolete components, financially impossible to restore. The recommendation had been simple. Scrap them, melt them down, recover whatever metal remained. Victoria hadn't hesitated. She had glanced at the reports for less than 3 minutes before signing her name across the final page. It was another routine business decision, another line item in another quarterly report. But now those same engines stood on polished platforms surrounded by collectors, aerospace museums, restoration experts, and private investors from across the country, each convinced they were looking at something extraordinary. $3 million. The auctioneer announced as another paddle rose near the back of the room. The crowd inhaled almost as one. Kamera shatters klicked. Phones lifted. Even veteran auction staff exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody had expected discarded machinery to command the price of luxury estates. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes toward the man standing quietly beside the display. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. He simply rested one hand on the shoulder of a little girl who looked no older than 10. Ethan Walker wore worn blue jeans, an old denim work shirt, and boots that still carried faint traces of garage dust despite his best efforts to clean them. Nothing about him suggested millionaire. Nothing suggested genius. To most people, he looked like an ordinary single father who spent long days repairing engines to keep the lights on and food on the table. His daughter looked up at him with quiet pride instead of surprise, as though she had known this moment would come long before anyone else. Ethan noticed Victoria watching him, and for a brief second their eyes met across the crowded room. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. 8 weeks earlier, she had dismissed 6 machines as worthless. 8 weeks earlier, he had looked at those same engines only once before, quietly saying words that everyone in the warehouse laughed at. "You're not throwing away scrap," he had said in an almost conversational voice. "You're throwing away $3 million. They had laughed then. Tonight, no one laughed at all. 8 weeks earlier, long before reporters crowded around polished auction platforms and investors fought over forgotten machinery, Ethan Walker unlocked the faded blue garage door that had become both his livelihood and his refuge. Every weekday began before sunrise. At 5:30 in the morning, the small building already smelled of old motor oil, fresh coffee, steel shavings, and pine cleaner that never quite erased the history soaked into the concrete floor. A single radio rested on a dusty shelf near the tool cabinet, quietly playing classic country songs while the first light filtered through narrow windows streaked with years of honest work. Ethan believed machines deserve patience because people rarely gave each other enough of it. He never hurried an engine. He listened to it. He watched the smallest details that others ignored. His hands moved carefully, never dramatically, tightening bolts with steady confidence instead of unnecessary force. Customers often joked that he could hear problems an engine had not discovered yet. He would simply smile and return to work. His greatest audience, however, was never the customers. It was Lily. Every morning before school, she sat on an old wooden stool beside his workbench, finishing homework while sipping hot chocolate from the same blue mug her mother had once used. She loved guessing what kind of vehicle would arrive next. Sometimes it was an aging pickup truck owned by a retired farmer. Sometimes it was a delivery van that had crossed hundreds of thousands of miles. Occasionally, a beautifully restored classic rolled inside, making her eyes sparkle before Ethan gently reminded her that every machine deserved equal respect, whether it was worth $500 or $500,000. Lily had learned early that her father never judged value by appearance. She watched him greet every customer exactly the same way, with calm eyes, a warm handshake, and quiet attention. Money never changed his manners. Titles never changed his tone. By 8 o'clock, the garage usually echoed with the soft tapping of wrenches, the steady hum of air compressors, and birds singing outside beyond the cracked parking lot where wildflowers somehow found room to grow through broken asphalt. Life was simple. Bills arrived every month with dependable punctuality. Some weeks were comfortable. Others required careful budgeting, homemade dinners, and postponing repairs on Ethan's own aging pickup. Yet Lily never remembered hearing her father complain. Whenever she asked why they did not own a bigger house or a newer truck like some of her classmates' families, Ethan always answered with the same gentle smile. We already have everything that matters. The rest comes when it is ready. Very few people knew there had been another version of Ethan Walker years before. His framed engineering degrees stayed inside a cardboard box tucked beneath an old storage cabinet, collecting dust beside family photo albums and forgotten Christmas decorations. The patents carrying his name remained hidden behind stacks of tax records that no visitor would ever notice. He never mentioned conferences, research laboratories, or prototype facilities. Those chapters belonged to another lifetime, one that quietly ended after his wife passed away and a little girl needed a father more than the world needed another brilliant engineer. So Ethan traded executive meetings for grease, stained gloves, traded corporate presentations for bedtime stories, and discovered that raising one extraordinary daughter was a greater achievement than receiving applause from any boardroom. He never regretted the exchange, even if the world had completely forgotten the man he used to be. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived at Ethan's garage, tucked between utility bills and parts catalogs that usually filled his mailbox. The return address belonged to Sterling Dynamics. Most mechanics in the county knew the company by reputation alone. Their factories built advanced industrial turbines, aerospace components, and specialized power systems shipped across the world. Ethan paused for only a second before opening the letter with a small utility knife. Inside was a public notice announcing the liquidation of obsolete research assets. Among the listings were 6 prototype turbine engines scheduled for disposal at a secured industrial yard less than 40 miles away. Lily looked over his shoulder as he quietly read every page twice. "Are they selling airplanes?" she asked with innocent curiosity. Ethan smiled softly. "No, they're selling something much more interesting." That Saturday morning they drove together in Ethan's old pickup beneath clear blue skies as the late summer sun stretched across endless fields outside the city. The industrial yard stood behind tall security fencing where rows of retired equipment waited for recycling. Massive generators, worn compressors, damaged machinery, and forgotten experimental hardware filled acres of concrete like a museum dedicated to abandoned ideas. Employees wearing bright safety vests guided visitors through organized inspection lanes while forklifts moved steel crates with practiced precision. At the far end of the yard, Ethan stopped walking. 6 identical turbine engines rested beneath gray protective covers. Even before the coverings were removed, something about their placement caught his attention. He walked around them slowly without saying a word. One inspector noticed him lingering and laughed politely. "Do not waste too much time on those. Every expert already did. They are finished." Ethan nodded respectfully. "May I take a closer look?" The inspector shrugged and lifted one cover. Surface corrosion marked several exposed sections. Warning tags hung from multiple access panels. Thick binders containing technical evaluations rested on a nearby table. Ethan did not reach for the paperwork. Instead, he crouched beside the first engine, running his fingers lightly across a compressor housing before looking toward a narrow inspection port hidden beneath years of accumulated dust. His eyes narrowed, not with excitement, but with careful curiosity. He circled each engine once, occasionally tapping gently against the metal with the handle of a small flashlight from his pocket. Lily watched silently because she recognized the expression on her father's face. It was the same expression he wore whenever he solved a difficult repair without speaking. A black luxury sedan rolled into the inspection area moments later. Conversations quieted almost immediately as Victoria Sterling stepped out accompanied by several executives and senior engineers. She carried herself with calm authority, greeting employees by name while reviewing inventory reports on a digital tablet. One engineer gestured toward the 6 engines. Complete losses, he explained confidently. Every evaluation reached the same conclusion. Victoria glanced toward the machinery with little emotion. Then proceed with disposal. Ethan stood slowly and brushed the dust from his hands. His voice remained calm enough that only those standing nearby heard him. May I ask one question before they are cut apart? Several executives turned toward the unknown mechanic. Victoria lowered her tablet and studied him with polite impatience. Go ahead. Ethan looked directly at the nearest engine instead of at her. Did anyone inspect the thermal balancing chambers after the final calibration sequence? The engineers exchanged puzzled looks before one of them answered with a faint smile. There was no reason to. The engines are dead. Ethan nodded once. I do not believe they are. I believe you are about to throw away something worth millions. For a heartbeat, the entire group remained silent. Then quiet laughter spread across the inspection yard, as if the suggestion itself belonged among the discarded machines. The laughter lingered only for a few seconds, but to Lily it sounded much louder than it really was. She instinctively reached for her father's hand, expecting him to defend himself or simply walk away. Ethan did neither. He stood with the same quiet posture he carried inside his garage every morning, his shoulders relaxed, his expression unchanged. Victoria Sterling looked at him for another moment before closing the tablet in her hand. You believe 6 independent engineering teams missed something? She asked evenly. Ethan nodded once. I believe they were looking for failure instead of possibility. One of the senior engineers folded his arms with visible confidence. Sir, every combustion chamber was inspected. Every rotor assembly was scanned. Every performance simulation confirmed catastrophic degradation. Ethan smiled politely. That is exactly why everyone reached the same conclusion. Another engineer frowned. Meaning, Ethan slowly walked toward the nearest engine and gently brushed away another layer of dust from a small inspection cover that almost disappeared beneath faded paint. You all examined what the reports told you to examine. He lightly tapped the metal with one finger. Nobody asked whether the reports were asking the wrong question. A few workers exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria remained silent. She had spent years leading experts, and one lesson had stayed with her longer than any business textbook. Truly confident people rarely raise their voices. Ethan certainly was not. Explain, she finally said. Ethan crouched beside the engine again. Every report assumes these units failed because of thermal fatigue. He pointed toward a narrow housing located behind the compressor section. But if the balancing chambers were calibrated with the original prototype software instead of the updated sequence, the sensors would create false overheating data. One engineer laughed again, although this time the laughter sounded forced. That is impossible. Ethan looked at him kindly rather than defensively. Did anyone physically verify the balancing chambers? Silence answered first. The engineer flipped through one inspection binder. Another opened digital maintenance records on a tablet. Pages turned. Screen scrolled. Nobody spoke. Ethan stood and continued quietly. False sensor feedback would explain every abnormal reading without requiring catastrophic structural damage. Victoria watched several members of her engineering division search through reports with increasing urgency. Finally, one younger engineer looked up. There is no inspection record for the balancing chambers. Another added, The maintenance checklist references software validation only. The first engineer who had dismissed Ethan cleared his throat. That does not prove anything. Ethan agreed immediately. No, it does not. That is why I never said they were fully functional. He rested one hand against the cool metal casing. I only said they were worth far more than scrap. The afternoon breeze swept across the industrial yard, carrying the scent of hot steel and machine oil through the quiet rows of retired equipment. Somewhere in the distance, a forklift backed up, its warning signal echoing across the concrete before fading into silence. Victoria stepped closer to the engine herself. For the first time that morning, she looked at it not as inventory, but as a question waiting to be answered. If you are wrong, she said calmly, you will be buying 6 very expensive pieces of useless metal. Ethan met her eyes without hesitation. If I am wrong, I will accept that. Then his gaze drifted back toward the engines. But if I am right, your company is about to destroy something it spent years trying to create. Another long silence settled over the yard. It was no longer the silence of amusement. It was the quieter, heavier silence that arrives when certainty begins to crack. Victoria folded her arms and considered the 6 silent engines for several long seconds before turning toward the asset manager. What is the liquidation value? The manager checked his clipboard. Based on scrap weight and transportation costs, approximately $28,000 for the entire group. Ethan quietly calculated the number in his head. It represented nearly everything he had saved over years of careful living. Every extra repair completed after hours, every vacation he had postponed, every unnecessary purchase he had chosen to avoid, every dollar placed into a modest savings account for someday. Lily looked up at him, sensing the weight of the moment without fully understanding the mathematics behind it. Victoria glanced back toward Ethan. You seem convinced. Are you making an offer? Several executives smiled, certain the conversation would end there. They expected the ordinary mechanic to thank everyone for their time and leave with his dignity intact. Instead, Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. The smile slowly disappeared. I will purchase all 6. The asset manager blinked in surprise. Every one of them. Every one. One executive shook his head. That is a tremendous financial risk. Ethan nodded politely. I know. Another engineer spoke with genuine concern rather than arrogance this time. You understand there are absolutely no guarantees. There never are, Ethan replied. Not in engineering. Not in life. Lily gently tugged at his sleeve after the discussion moved a few steps away. She lowered her voice so only her father could hear. Dad, is this all of the money? Ethan looked down at her with the same calm expression she had trusted since childhood. Almost all of it. Her eyes widened slightly. What if everyone else is right? He rested one hand lightly on her shoulder. Then we will work hard, save again, and keep moving forward. She thought quietly for a moment before asking the question that mattered most. And if you are right? Ethan smiled with quiet warmth. Then someone gave up too soon. Lily smiled back because she understood her father better than anyone. He never gambled on luck. He only trusted what he had earned through knowledge, patience, and experience. Within the hour, paperwork was completed, signatures exchanged, and ownership officially transferred. Employees watched in disbelief as arrangements were made to transport 6 enormous engines away from one of the country's largest manufacturing companies to a modest, independent garage on the edge of town. Several workers whispered that the mechanic had ruined himself financially. Others believed pride had clouded his judgment. One younger technician simply stared at Ethan with growing curiosity, wondering what kind of person could risk everything while remaining so remarkably peaceful. Victoria observed the entire process from a short distance. Something continued to bother her. It was not the purchase itself. Wealthy collectors often bought unusual equipment for sentimental reasons. What unsettled her was Ethan's complete absence of excitement. He did not behave like a man chasing fortune. He behaved like someone retrieving something he had quietly recognized long before everyone else. As the flatbed trucks slowly carried the engines toward the highway, the afternoon sunlight reflected across weathered metal that most people still considered worthless. Ethan climbed into his aging pickup with Lily beside him and followed the convoy home at an unhurried pace. Neither of them spoke for several miles. Finally, Lily looked out the passenger window and whispered, "They still think you are making a mistake." Ethan kept his eyes on the road and answered with gentle certainty. Sometimes the loudest opinions arrive before the quietest truth. Let us see which one lasts longer. The 6 engines arrived at Ethan's garage just before sunset, filling nearly every available foot of space inside the modest building that had never been designed for projects of this size. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch the flatbed trucks unload what many assumed were expensive mistakes. Some waved politely. Others simply shook their heads before driving away. Ethan thanked each driver personally, signed the final delivery papers, and waited until the rumble of the departing trucks disappeared down the county road. Only then did he slowly walk around the engines again, studying them as if greeting old friends after many years. Apart, Lily unlocked the tool cabinets without being asked. She already knew the evening routine. Bright work lights flickered on one by one, filling the garage with warm light while the familiar scent of machine oil mixed with fresh coffee brewing in the corner. Outside, crickets began their nightly chorus. Inside, every sound became deliberate. A wrench rested softly on steel. A notebook opened across the workbench. Ethan did not touch a single bolt for almost 20 minutes. Instead, he examined every inspection tag left by Sterling Dynamics, comparing handwritten notes with faded manufacturing markings stamped into the metal years earlier. Finally, he picked up a grease pencil and drew 6 small circles on one engine housing. Lily tilted her head with curiosity. "Are those the broken parts?" Ethan smiled gently without looking up. "No." "Then what are they?" He placed the pencil down beside an old flashlight. "Those are the places everyone believed the answers would be." Lily frowned slightly. "And they were wrong?" Ethan nodded once. "Sometimes when many intelligent people reach the same conclusion, it only means they started with the same assumption." He walked toward the rear section of the turbine, where a narrow access cover sat almost hidden beneath protective shielding. Most technicians would have needed several hours to begin disassembly. Ethan removed the cover in less than 15 minutes. Not because he rushed, but because his hands seemed to remember every fastener before his eyes found it. Layer after layer came away until a compact chamber appeared deep inside the assembly. It looked remarkably clean compared with the surrounding components. Ethan shined his flashlight across the interior, and for the first time all evening, he quietly smiled. "There you are." Lily stepped closer. "What did you find?" He pointed toward a nearly invisible alignment mark no wider than a pencil line. "Not damage." His voice remained calm. "Evidence." She looked carefully but could not understand. "It is so small." Ethan nodded. "The most expensive mistakes usually are." He retrieved an old binder from the highest shelf in the garage, its worn cover showing years of careful use. Inside were handwritten engineering notes, formulas, sketches, and calibration diagrams that he had preserved long after leaving the corporate world behind. Lily noticed one page carried a familiar company logo near the bottom. "Is that from Sterling Dynamics?" Ethan paused for only a heartbeat before answering. "From a long time ago." He compared one diagram with the markings inside the balancing chamber, then slowly closed the binder. Everything fit together more clearly than he had hoped. The engines had never been destroyed by failed metal or impossible wear. They had been condemned by measurements that pointed skilled engineers toward the wrong conclusion from the very beginning. Ethan leaned back against the workbench and looked across the quiet garage filled with 6 silent machines, waiting for someone to understand them. He did not celebrate. He simply whispered with quiet gratitude, "You were never broken. You were only misunderstood." The next morning the garage woke before the sun again, but this time the air carried a different kind of anticipation. Ethan rolled open the large door, just enough to welcome the cool morning breeze before switching on every work light above the first engine. He spread his handwritten notes across the workbench beside the faded binder and carefully organized every tool he expected to need. There would be no shortcuts. There would be no guessing. Every adjustment had to be earned one careful step at a time. Lily arrived carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate and 1 cup of coffee balanced carefully on a tray. She smiled as she watched her father studying the engine in complete silence. "Are you making a repair today?" she asked. Ethan accepted the coffee with quiet gratitude. "Not yet." She looked surprised. "I thought you already knew what was wrong." He nodded gently. Knowing the answer and proving the answer are 2 different things. He carefully removed another inspection panel and exposed a series of compact calibration assemblies hidden deep inside the turbine housing. Instead of replacing expensive components, he reached for a precision measuring tool that looked older than Lily herself. Every reading matched the numbers he had expected. He wrote each measurement neatly into his notebook before checking the next location. Hours passed without dramatic discoveries. Only patience. Only careful observation. Outside, customers continued arriving with pickup trucks and family sedans needing ordinary repairs. Ethan never turned them away. He paused his restoration work whenever someone needed help, repaired brakes, changed water pumps, diagnosed engine lights, then quietly returned to the turbines after each customer left. By early afternoon, the first engine had been almost completely mapped without replacing a single major part. Lily watched him compare dozens of measurements before finally asking, "If nothing is broken, why would all those computers say it failed?" Ethan rested the measuring tool on the bench and smiled. Because computers only answer the questions people teach them to ask. He gently pointed toward the balancing chamber hidden beneath the protective housing. If one calibration sequence begins with the wrong reference point, every calculation after that will honestly report the wrong conclusion. Lily slowly nodded. So everyone trusted the numbers. Yes, Ethan answered softly. And they forgot to trust their curiosity. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Victoria Sterling sat inside a conference room reviewing quarterly production forecasts when one sentence from the previous weekend unexpectedly returned to her mind. "You are about to throw away something worth millions." She closed the financial report in front of her and looked toward her chief engineering officer. "Has anyone reopened the inspection files on the prototype turbines?" The executive looked surprised. "No, ownership transferred legally." "Why?" Victoria remained thoughtful for a moment before answering. "Because I do not like unanswered questions." Back inside the garage, Ethan reached into the narrow chamber with a custom alignment gauge he had built years earlier for work that almost nobody remembered anymore. The instrument settled perfectly into place. He looked at the reading once, then slowly closed his eyes as if confirming a memory rather than making a discovery. Everything fit. Every unusual sensor report. Every failed simulation. Every recommendation to scrap the engines. The flaw had never lived inside the metal. It had lived inside a sequence of assumptions repeated so often that they eventually became accepted as fact. Ethan quietly placed the gauge back into its worn wooden case and looked toward the 6 silent turbines waiting patiently around the garage. He whispered almost to himself, "The first engine is finally ready to tell the truth." For the next 4 evenings, the lights inside Ethan's garage remained on long after the rest of the neighborhood had gone dark. People driving past often slowed down, curious about the enormous machines occupying nearly every corner of the building. Some neighbors assumed he was rebuilding old industrial equipment for a large contractor. Others quietly wondered whether he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Ethan paid little attention to either opinion. Every adjustment followed the same careful rhythm. Measure, record, verify, repeat. He never rushed because experience had taught him that precision was always faster than correcting unnecessary mistakes. Lily became his trusted assistant, reading measurements aloud from the notebook while carefully labeling every component they removed and inspected. "Calibration housing complete," she announced one evening with quiet satisfaction. Ethan smiled. "Excellent. Now, let us check every reference point one more time." She laughed softly. Again, he looked at her with patient eyes. Especially again. By the end of the week, the first engine stood fully reassembled. At first glance, it looked almost unchanged. The weathered metal still carried scratches earned years earlier. The faded paint remained exactly as it had arrived from the industrial yard. Anyone expecting shiny new parts would have been disappointed. Ethan had replaced almost nothing. Instead, he had restored understanding. Early Saturday morning, he rolled the engine into the open work area just outside the garage where fresh air filled the quiet countryside. A small diagnostic cart rested beside the turbine, connected with neatly organized cables and monitoring equipment that Ethan had collected over many years. Lily stood several feet away, holding her breath without realizing it. "Are you nervous?" Ethan asked gently. She nodded. "A little." He smiled. "That means you care." He completed one final inspection before placing his hand on the control switch. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the driveway, while birds sang from the tall oak trees surrounding the property. For one peaceful moment, everything seemed perfectly still. Ethan pressed the starter sequence. At first, nothing happened except a faint mechanical click. Then the internal systems awakened exactly as they had been designed years before. Soft indicator lights illuminated across the diagnostic panel. The compressor began turning with smooth, deliberate motion. Seconds later, the turbine accelerated with remarkable stability, producing a deep, confident sound that echoed gently across the open fields instead of the rough vibration everyone had predicted. Lily's eyes grew wide with amazement. "Dad," she whispered, "it is alive." Ethan never looked away from the monitoring instruments. Every temperature reading remained steady. Every pressure value settled within normal operating limits. Every vibration graph traced nearly perfect lines across the display. After several minutes, he gradually reduced the power and allowed the engine to return to silence. He closed his notebook only after recording the final measurements. Then, for the first time since bringing the 6 engines home, he allowed himself a quiet smile. Lily suddenly wrapped her arms around him. "You were right." Ethan gently hugged her back before looking once more at the silent turbine. "No," he answered softly. "The engine was right. We simply listened long enough for it to prove it." Across the street, an elderly neighbor who had witnessed the entire test slowly lowered the phone he had used to record the remarkable moment. Within an hour, the short video began making its way across social media, carrying with it one simple question that no one at Sterling Dynamics was prepared to answer. If one engine had never been broken, what about the other 5? By Monday morning, the video had spread far beyond the quiet county where Ethan's little garage stood. Mechanics paused their work to replay the smooth turbine startup. Aerospace enthusiasts zoomed in on every instrument panel, searching for hidden clues. Retired engineers left thoughtful comments instead of quick opinions. Most agreed on only one thing. Whatever had happened inside that modest garage deserved a closer look. Ethan ignored the growing attention. He arrived before sunrise as always, unlocked the garage, poured fresh coffee, and began working on the second engine with the same patient rhythm that had restored the first. Fame had not changed his schedule because purpose had never depended on recognition. Lily entered carrying a small cardboard box filled with neatly labeled hardware they had cleaned the night before. She smiled when she noticed several news vans driving slowly past the end of their road. "They're looking for you," she said quietly. Ethan looked up for only a moment before returning to his measurements. "Then they will have to wait until we finish today's work." She laughed softly because that answer sounded exactly like her father. 40 miles away, however, waiting was no longer an option. Victoria Sterling sat alone inside her executive office, watching the same short video for the 5th time. She muted the audio and focused entirely on the diagnostic screen visible beside the turbine. Every operating value appeared remarkably stable. There was no obvious editing, no dramatic tricks, no impossible miracle, only engineering behaving exactly as it should. Her chief engineering officer entered carrying a thick folder filled with technical reports. "We reviewed the footage all morning," he admitted carefully. "If the readings are authentic, the engine should not have been classified as a total loss." Victoria remained silent. "We also reopened the archived development files." He hesitated before continuing. "There is something else you should see." He placed an older engineering binder on her desk. Across the cover was a project code from nearly 12 years earlier. Inside were original design approvals, calibration procedures, and technical recommendations signed by one lead systems engineer. Victoria slowly turned to the final page. The signature stopped her cold. Ethan Walker. She stared at the name much longer than necessary. Tried to remember why it sounded familiar. The personnel records arrived minutes later. Outstanding performance reviews. Multiple innovation awards. Several patented thermal balancing improvements still used throughout the company. Then one unexpected document explained everything. Resignation. Effective immediately. Reason given. Family responsibilities following the passing of his wife. Victoria quietly closed the file. No scandal. No conflict. No demand for recognition. He had simply walked away. She leaned back in her chair, realizing the ordinary mechanic standing in the salvage yard had not been questioning her engineers from arrogance. He had been protecting work he once understood better than almost anyone alive. Across town, Ethan carefully tightened the final fastener on the second engine before comparing two handwritten measurements. Lily noticed him pause and smile almost imperceptibly. "Another one?" she asked hopefully. Ethan nodded with quiet confidence. It is beginning to tell the same story. At that exact moment, a black luxury sedan turned slowly onto the narrow country road leading toward the garage. Victoria Sterling had canceled every remaining meeting on her calendar. For the first time in many years, the billionaire chief executive was not driving toward negotiation. She was driving toward an answer.